The Galactic Prince stood on the steps of Earth's central embassy, his golden eyes scanning the crowd with cold disdain. Clad in ceremonial battle armor etched with the symbols of his empire's countless victories, he raised his hand for silence. The murmuring masses obeyed, their curiosity outweighed by the sheer presence of the alien royal. "People of Earth," he began, his voice amplified by the translator embedded in his throat. "I am Kaylor, heir to the Valoran throne. Today, I issue a challenge, not just to your leaders, but to your very existence." The crowd stirred uneasily. The broadcast feeds of every major network zoomed in, capturing his every move. Billions of eyes across the galaxy watched as the prince unsheathed his ceremonial sword, its blade humming faintly with restrained energy. "I challenge your greatest warrior to a duel," Kaylor continued, his lips curling into a smirk. "Let them face me in combat, and through their strength or failure, we will decide whether humanity deserves its place among the stars. Prove to us you are more than the fragile, primitive species our histories paint you to be. Or confirm it." Gasps rippled through the crowd. This wasn't just an exhibition of might. It was a public humiliation thinly veiled as a test. The message was clear. Humanity's reputation rested on this duel. For a moment there was silence. Then, a voice called out from the crowd. "I'll do it." Heads turned as a man stepped forward. He was neither tall nor imposing, and he lacked the aura of a seasoned soldier. His clothes, a plain jacket and jeans, looked as though he'd just walked out of a cafe. Kaylor tilted his head, his smirk widening. "This is your champion?" he asked, amusement dripping from every word. The man reached the front of the crowd, his hands casually stuffed in his pockets. He seemed almost bored, as if the prospect of fighting a galactic warrior prince was little more than a mild inconvenience. "Name's David Shaw," he said simply. "Anya, I'll take you on." Laughter erupted from Kaylor's entourage, a chorus of mockery amplified by their translator devices. The prince himself chuckled, shaking his head. "You're either brave or foolish, human," Kaylor said, stepping closer until they were mere feet apart. His towering form cast a shadow over David. "Perhaps both. Do you have any idea who I am?" David shrugged. "Some prince with a shiny sword. Doesn't matter." The crowd froze. The air between the two men seemed to crackle with tension, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Kaylor's amusement evaporated, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "You mock me?" "No," David said, his tone calm but firm. "I just don't think you're as special as you think you are." A murmur swept through the crowd, the boldness of the statement shocking even the most skeptical onlookers. Kaylor's grip tightened on his sword, but he didn't raise it. "Not yet. You're either a fool or a madman," the prince said at last. "But I'll accept your challenge. Tomorrow, at dawn, we shall duel in the arena. And when I leave you broken before your people, they will understand their place." David met his gaze without flinching. "We'll see." Kaylor turned on his heel, his entourage trailing behind him like shadows. The crowd parted to let them pass, the tension still thick in the air. As the prince disappeared into his armored shuttle, a reporter approached David, microphone trembling in her hand. "Mr. Shaw," she asked, "why did you step forward? Are you trained for this?" David glanced at her, a faint smile playing at his lips. "Let's just say I've learned a thing or two about fights." He turned and walked away, leaving the crowd and the galaxy, wondering if Earth's unassuming champion was humanity's greatest mistake or its secret weapon. The arena was an architectural marvel, a shimmering coliseum of glass and metal suspended above the Pacific Ocean by anti-grav engines. Its transparent dome offered a view of the endless blue waves below, as well as the millions of drones hovering nearby to broadcast the duel across the galaxy. Inside, a deafening roar of anticipation echoed from the stands, packed with spectators of every species imaginable. David Shaw stood in the preparation chamber, watching the final countdown tick away on the wall. His reflection stared back at him from the polished surface of a nearby console. He wasn't wearing armor, just a plain combat suit provided by the event organizers. The suit was unremarkable, durable enough to withstand a few glancing blows, but offering little in the way of protection. He adjusted the cuffs with a calm precision that belied the stakes of the upcoming duel. A low hum signaled the chamber door opening. A steward entered, an insectoid being with iridescent wings. Its compound eyes flicked nervously between David and the floor. "Mr. Shaw," it buzzed, voice halting. "The duel begins in 5 minutes. Are you prepared?" David gave the creature a small smile. "I'm ready." The steward hesitated, then tilted its head. "Forgive me, but why did you volunteer? You are not like the others, who might have represented your kind." "Because I knew I had to," David replied simply. Before the steward could respond, the intercom blared. "Challengers, to the arena." David walked toward the exit, the steward scuttling nervously aside. The corridor leading to the battleground was long and cold, the distant sound of the crowd growing louder with each step. As he emerged into the arena, the sheer scale of the Colosseum hit him. Tens of thousands of spectators filled the stands, their cheers mingling with the faint whir of drones circling above. At the far end of the arena stood Kaylor, resplendent in golden armor that gleamed under the artificial sunlight. His sword, an elegant and deadly blade, rested easily in his hand. Kaylor's gaze locked onto David, his smirk returning. He raised his arms, basking in the adulation of the crowd. The Valoran prince was in his element, a conqueror poised to add another victory to his legacy. David, by contrast, walked to the center of the arena with quiet purpose. He didn't wave to the crowd or acknowledge the cameras. He simply stopped, hands at his sides, and waited. A booming voice filled the arena. "Today's duel is sanctioned under the Galactic Concord and overseen by the High Tribunal. The rules are simple. Combatants shall rely solely on their skill and strength. The victor is determined by submission, incapacitation, or death." The crowd roared again, but David remained unmoved. His focus was entirely on Kaylor. The announcer continued. "On one side, we have Kaylor, Crown Prince of the Valoran Empire and undefeated champion of over 100 duels. On the other, David Shaw of Earth, a challenger whose background remains unconventional." Laughter rippled through the stands at the thinly veiled insult. Kaylor's grin widened as he took his position. The announcer concluded, "Let the duel commence." Kaylor wasted no time. The instant the signal sounded, he surged forward, a golden blur of precision and power. His blade sliced through the air, aiming directly for David's chest. David sidestepped, the movement so fluid it seemed effortless. Kaylor's sword missed by inches, his momentum carrying him forward. David pivoted, using the prince's speed against him, and delivered a precise strike to Kaylor's ribs. The crowd gasped. Kaylor stumbled, but quickly recovered, his expression shifting from smug confidence to irritation. "You've trained," Kaylor said, his voice low and sharp. "A bit," David replied, his tone maddeningly casual. Kaylor attacked again, this time with a series of rapid strikes. His blade moved like a whirlwind, each slash designed to overwhelm. But David wasn't there to meet them. He moved with uncanny grace, dodging and weaving, his every step calculated to avoid the prince's onslaught. For the first time, doubt flickered in Kaylor's eyes. The crowd, initially roaring with approval for Kaylor, began to quiet. Whispers of disbelief rippled through the stands. This was no fluke. David Shaw was holding his own against a warrior who had never known defeat. Kaylor's frustration boiled over. He roared, lunging forward with reckless abandon. David caught the motion instantly. In a single, fluid movement, he sidestepped and delivered a sweeping kick that knocked Kaylor off his feet. The arena fell silent as the prince hit the ground. David stepped back, giving Kaylor room to rise. "You're fast, I'll give you that," he said. "But speed's not everything." Kaylor growled, pushing himself to his feet. "You'll regret mocking me, human." David's calm expression didn't waver. "We'll see." The duel was far from over. But the galaxy had already learned one undeniable truth. Humanity was not as weak as the Valoran prince had believed. Kaylor lunged, his blade arcing through the air with deadly precision. The energy-lined edge shimmered, a gleaming symbol of Valoran craftsmanship designed to cleave through armor and bone alike. Yet as fast as the prince was, David Shaw was faster, or perhaps just smarter. The crowd held its collective breath as David twisted, sidestepping the swing with an almost lazy grace. The blade passed so close that it ruffled his hair, but his expression didn't change. Kaylor recovered instantly, pivoting to deliver a brutal follow-up strike. David ducked beneath it, his movements fluid and controlled, as if he were performing a dance only he knew the steps to. "You're quick," Kaylor admitted, his voice tinged with grudging respect. "But this isn't a game, human. You can't dodge forever." David smiled faintly, his hands loose at his sides. "Who said anything about forever?" Kaylor snarled, closing the distance between them with a flurry of strikes. His blade became a blur, each swing aimed to corner and overwhelm his opponent. The crowd roared with approval, the Valoran spectators confident in their prince's inevitable triumph. But David didn't falter. He slipped between the attacks like water flowing around rocks, his body a masterclass in economy of motion. His lack of offense wasn't weakness, it was patience. He wasn't just surviving, he was learning. Kaylor pressed harder, his strikes growing more aggressive. Sweat began to bead on his brow, the first sign that his frustration was catching up to him. "Fight me," Kaylor bellowed, his voice echoing through the arena. David's calm demeanor didn't waver. "I am." And then he struck. It wasn't flashy or telegraphed. It wasn't the kind of move that would draw cheers from the crowd. But it was precise. Kaylor's next swing left his left side exposed for a fraction of a second, and David exploited it. He stepped into the opening and delivered a sharp elbow to the prince's ribs. Kaylor staggered back, his breath hitching as pain lanced through his side. He recovered quickly, but his expression betrayed his shock. No one had ever struck him before. The crowd erupted, half in disbelief, half in exhilaration. Kaylor's golden eyes narrowed, his expression darkening. "You'll pay for that." David tilted his head, his smile faint but unyielding. "I think you're starting to realize that speed and strength aren't everything." Kaylor didn't reply. He charged again, this time with more caution. His swings were deliberate now, his movements tighter. But David continued to evade, always one step ahead. It wasn't just speed, Kaylor realized. The human was reading him, anticipating his attacks before they landed. "Who trained you?" Kaylor demanded between swings. David ducked beneath another slash and stepped back, keeping a careful distance. "Let's just say I've had good teachers." Kaylor growled, his frustration mounting. He feinted high and swung low, hoping to catch David off guard. But David anticipated the move, hopping lightly over the low slash and delivering a swift kick to Kaylor's wrist. The blade clattered to the ground. Gasps filled the arena as Kaylor stared at his empty hand in disbelief. No one had ever disarmed him before. David didn't capitalize on the moment. He stepped back, giving Kaylor space to retrieve his weapon. The gesture wasn't one of arrogance, but of respect. Kaylor retrieved his blade, his grip tightening as he glared at David. "You're mocking me?" "No," David said simply. "I just believe in giving people a fair fight." Kaylor's lip curled, and he launched himself forward with a roar. This time, his attacks were even fiercer, his movements sharper. But David's defense remained impenetrable. The crowd's mood began to shift. What had started as confidence in Kaylor's superiority now teetered on uncertainty. Whispers spread through the stands, questions forming among the spectators. How was this human holding his own? Kaylor's strikes slowed, his breathing labored. His golden armor glistened with sweat under the artificial sunlight. "You're pushing too hard," David observed, his tone calm. "You're not fighting to win, you're fighting not to lose. There's a difference." Kaylor's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. David's eyes softened. "You're good, Kaylor. But you've been taught that strength is about domination. It's not." Kaylor lunged again, but this time his movements lacked their earlier precision. David sidestepped, and in a single fluid motion, swept Kaylor's legs out from under him. The prince hit the ground hard, his sword skidding out of reach. David stood over him, calm and unshaken. "This isn't about strength. It's about understanding your opponent. Maybe it's time you started learning instead of trying to prove something." Kaylor stared up at him, his chest heaving with exhaustion. The arena fell silent, the weight of David's words hanging in the air. The duel wasn't over, but for the first time, Kaylor looked less like a warrior and more like a student struggling to grasp an unfamiliar lesson. Kaylor pushed himself up from the ground, his body aching with a fatigue he hadn't felt in years. His sword lay a few feet away, but retrieving it felt more like a humiliation than a necessity. For a moment, he simply stared at David Shaw, the unassuming human who had not only matched him but exposed every weakness he thought he had buried. The arena, once filled with cheers, now simmered with uneasy silence. The Valoran spectators, who had come to witness their prince's inevitable triumph, looked on with growing disbelief. Even the humans in the audience, initially apprehensive, now leaned forward, sensing a shift in the air. David stood motionless, his hands loose at his sides. He made no move to attack, no attempt to press his advantage. Instead, he regarded Kaylor with an unsettling calm, as if waiting for the prince to decide his next move. Kaylor's fists clenched. He was the heir to the most powerful empire in the galaxy, a warrior trained from birth to embody strength and superiority. How could he be faltering against a man who looked like he belonged behind a desk, not on a battlefield? "You mock me," Kaylor said through gritted teeth. David shook his head. "No. I'm giving you a chance to think. You should try it." The crowd gasped, the audacity of the statement reverberating across the arena. Kaylor's temper flared. "Think? What is there to think about? Strength wins battles. Always." David raised an eyebrow. "Does it? Then why aren't you winning?" The words hit Kaylor like a physical blow. For a moment, he couldn't respond. Instead, he reached for his sword, gripping it tightly as he rose to his full height. "If strength isn't the answer," Kaylor said, his voice low and dangerous, "then prove it to me." David's expression softened, but his stance shifted subtly. His feet planted firmly, his body angled to anticipate Kaylor's next move. "That's what I've been doing, Your Highness." With a roar, Kaylor charged, his blade arcing toward David with renewed fury. The human sidestepped effortlessly, but this time, Kaylor was ready. He twisted mid-swing, using the momentum to reverse his attack. The strike came faster than David had anticipated. The blade grazed his shoulder, cutting through the fabric of his suit and drawing a thin line of blood. The crowd erupted, cheers and gasps mingling in the air. For a moment, Kaylor's confidence surged. He pressed forward, his strikes growing more precise, fueled by a newfound determination. But David didn't panic. He adjusted his stance, his movements tightening. He began countering Kaylor's attacks with minimal effort, deflecting each strike with subtle, almost imperceptible shifts in his body. "You're improving," David said, his voice calm even as Kaylor's blade whistled past his ear. "Don't patronize me." Kaylor snapped, his strikes growing erratic once more. David sighed, sidestepping another swing and delivering a swift, calculated palm strike to Kaylor's chest. The force sent the prince stumbling back, his grip on his sword faltering. "You're still fighting like you have something to prove," David said, his tone firm but not unkind. "That's your problem, Kaylor. You think strength is about dominance. It's not. Real strength is knowing when not to fight." Kaylor's chest heaved as he steadied himself, his grip tightening on his blade. He wanted to dismiss David's words as the ramblings of a weaker opponent, but something about them gnawed at him. "You're saying I should just give up?" Kaylor spat. "No," David said, taking a step closer. "I'm saying you should fight for the right reasons. You're not here to protect anyone, to prove a principle, or to make the galaxy better. You're here because you want to win. And that's why you're losing." The words hung in the air, their weight pressing down on Kaylor. For the first time, he hesitated. The crowd seemed to sense the shift. The cheers grew quieter, replaced by murmurs of uncertainty. Even the drones hovering above the arena seemed to pause, their cameras fixed on the prince's expression. Kaylor's sword arm wavered, his confidence unraveling. He had never been questioned like this, never been forced to confront the emptiness behind his own motivations. David's voice softened. "You're better than this, Kaylor. You don't need to prove your strength to me or anyone else. What you need is to understand what strength is really for." Kaylor's grip loosened, the tip of his sword dipping toward the ground. For a moment, he simply stared at David, his golden eyes filled with conflict. The arena waited, the entire galaxy watching as Kaylor stood on the precipice of a decision that could change everything. And then, slowly, he lowered his weapon. Kaylor's sword clattered against the ground, the metallic ring echoing in the stunned silence of the arena. The Prince of the Valoran Empire stood motionless, his chest heaving as he stared at David Shaw. His hands, once so confident in their grip on the weapon, now hung limply at his sides. The crowd erupted into chaos. Valoran loyalists shouted in anger and disbelief, their voices clashing with the cheers and applause from the human contingent. Across the galaxy, billions of viewers leaned closer to their screens, unable to process what they had just witnessed. The heir to the mightiest empire in the stars had yielded, not by force, but by choice. David didn't move. He stood in the center of the arena, his expression calm but unreadable. His blood-streaked shoulder was the only visible sign that this duel had been a real fight, but his posture remained relaxed, almost casual. Kaylor's breathing slowed as he wrestled with his thoughts. He had never dropped his weapon in combat, never surrendered, not even in training. Yet here he was, disarmed and humbled before a species he had been taught to view as inferior. "What now?" Kaylor asked, his voice quiet but heavy. David took a step forward, closing the gap between them. His movements were slow, deliberate, like a teacher approaching a struggling student. "Now," he said, "you learn." Kaylor bristled at the tone, but said nothing. David gestured to the fallen sword. "Pick it up." Kaylor hesitated, then bent down and retrieved the weapon. He held it loosely, its weight suddenly unfamiliar in his hands. David nodded. "Good. Now tell me, why do you fight?" The question caught Kaylor off guard. "What kind of question is that?" "The most important kind," David replied. "Why do you fight? What are you trying to prove?" Kaylor's grip on the sword tightened. "I fight because I am Valoran, because strength is everything. It's how we lead, how we survive." "Is it?" David asked, tilting his head. "You think strength is about swinging a sword better than anyone else? About dominating your enemies until they kneel? That's not strength, Kaylor. That's fear." Kaylor's jaw clenched. "Fear? You call the Valoran Empire's dominance fear?" David's gaze hardened. "Yes. Fear of looking weak. Fear of losing control. Fear of facing something or someone you can't conquer. That's why you fight so hard. Not because you're strong, but because you're afraid of what happens if you aren't." Kaylor took a step back, the words cutting deeper than any blade. "You're wrong," he said, though the conviction in his voice was faltering. "Am I?" David countered. "You came here to prove humanity was unworthy, that we were too fragile to stand among the stars. But look at where we are. I didn't beat you with strength or speed. I beat you because I wasn't fighting to prove anything. I was fighting to show you the truth." Kaylor's mind raced, replaying every moment of the duel. He had been faster, stronger, more experienced. Yet none of it had mattered. David had seen through every move, exposed every flaw, and turned his own arrogance against him. For the first time, Kaylor considered the possibility that his entire life had been built on a flawed foundation. "What is strength, then?" Kaylor asked, his voice barely above a whisper. David smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried more weight than any lecture. "Strength is knowing when to fight and when to walk away. It's standing up for something bigger than yourself, protecting those who can't protect themselves. Strength isn't about breaking others. It's about building something better." Kaylor's shoulders sagged. The words resonated in a way he couldn't deny. "Your people look up to you, Kaylor," David continued. "They follow you because they believe in you. But what kind of leader are you if all you can offer them is fear disguised as strength?" Kaylor looked around the arena. The Valoran spectators were watching him intently, their expressions ranging from confusion to disappointment. They had expected a triumph, a show of dominance. Instead, they were witnessing their prince stand humbled by a human who hadn't even drawn a weapon. Kaylor turned back to David. "I don't know how to lead any other way," he admitted. David placed a hand on Kaylor's shoulder, ignoring the gasp from the crowd. "Then learn. Strength isn't about knowing all the answers. It's about being willing to find them." The words settled into Kaylor's mind like seeds, fragile yet undeniable. The arena remained silent as Kaylor sheathed his sword and bowed his head. "You've given me much to think about, David Shaw." David nodded. "That's a start." As a crowd erupted in a cacophony of reactions, the Valoran prince and the human challenger stood together in the center of the arena. One humbled, the other resolute, but both forever changed. The duel was over, but the repercussions were only beginning. Kaylor Vorith stood in the center of the arena, his golden armor tarnished by sweat and scratches, his sword sheathed at his side. He had come to Earth to prove the might of the Valoran Empire, to demonstrate its unassailable strength. Instead, he found himself humbled, standing beside a man who had defeated him not with brute force, but with something far more profound. David Shaw stood next to him, his expression calm, his presence steady. Despite the blood streaking his shoulder and the exhaustion etched into his features, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. The crowd's roar filled the arena, but it was no longer one of outrage or disbelief. It was something more complicated, a mixture of awe, respect, and, in some corners, begrudging admiration. The spectators, both human and alien, had witnessed a moment that defied their expectations and reshaped their understanding of what strength truly meant. Kaylor turned to David, his voice low enough to be lost in the noise of the crowd. "You've changed things today, not just for me, but for all who watched." David glanced at him, his faint smile returning. "That was the idea." As the arena's announcer declared the duel concluded, and the participants victorious in their own ways, Kaylor raised his hand, silencing the crowd. The motion was instinctive, a gesture honed over years of command. But this time, his voice carried a different tone, one of humility and purpose. "People of the galaxy," he began, his voice amplified by the arena speakers, "I came to this planet to challenge humanity's worth. I believed their strength would pale in comparison to ours, that they were nothing more than a fragile species unfit for the stars. I was wrong." The murmurs in the stands grew louder, but Kaylor pressed on. "This human did not defeat me with raw power. He did not rely on arrogance or brute force. He won because he understood something I did not, that true strength lies in restraint, in understanding, and in fighting for something greater than oneself. Today, I leave this arena not as a victor, but as a student of the lesson he has taught me." Kaylor paused, his golden eyes scanning the crowd. "Let this moment mark the beginning of a new chapter, not just for my people, but for all who watched. The Valoran Empire has long believed in the supremacy of strength. But strength without purpose is hollow. It is time we re-examine what it means to be strong and how we use that strength in the galaxy." The silence that followed was palpable, as though the galaxy itself held its breath. Then, slowly, a ripple of applause began. It started with the humans in the stands, but spread to others. Tentative at first, then growing louder. Even the Valoran spectators, though reluctant, began to clap, their pride giving way to a begrudging respect. Kaylor turned back to David, extending a hand. "You've given me much to think about, David Shaw. Perhaps even more than I was ready for. But for that I am grateful." David shook his hand, his grip firm but not overbearing. "You'll figure it out, Kaylor. You've got the strength. Now you just need to decide how to use it." As the two warriors stood together, the arena's lights dimmed, signaling the end of the event. The crowd began to disperse, their conversations buzzing with speculation about what this duel would mean for the galaxy. Later, as David left the preparation chamber, a young human reporter approached him, microphone in hand. "Mr. Shaw," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "can I ask why you stepped forward to face the prince? Were you trying to prove humanity's strength?" David paused, his gaze thoughtful. "It was never about proving anything," he said. "It was about reminding everyone, including Kaylor, that strength isn't what defines us. What we do with it does." The reporter hesitated, then asked, "What's next for you?" David smiled faintly. "Getting back to my life. Maybe having a drink. I think I've earned it." He walked away, leaving the reporter stunned and the cameras rolling. Back in the arena, Kaylor stood at the observation deck, watching the Earth's ocean waves crash far below. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel the weight of expectation bearing down on him. Instead, he felt something unfamiliar but welcome, a sense of clarity. He placed a call to his ship. "Send word to my father," Kaylor said. "Tell him the duel is over. And tell him we need to talk about the future of our empire." As the transmission ended, Kaylor looked out at the horizon, the sun dipping below the Earth's curve. He didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time, he was ready to find out. And above, in the vastness of space, the galaxy shifted, forever changed by the day a galactic prince learned the true meaning of strength from an unassuming human.